I was not Yeah, I know. You watching the clock?
Just wait until 6.
Ready? Go.
Oh, wow. That's tinny. Good evening, everyone. I call the Thursday, August 12th, 2021 Peninsula School District Board of Directors study session to order. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next up, we have approval of the agenda. Are there any changes to tonight's agenda? Okay. Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Sorry.
It's been moved by Chuck and seconded by Deb to approve the agenda. I'll give you the next one. And then, is there any discussion on the consent agenda prior to a vote?
Just that if the chaperone's going to Honolulu, I volunteer.
I'll carry your suitcase if you get to go. Okay, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I move to approve the consent agenda.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved by Deb, seconded by Natalie to approve the consent agenda. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Okay. And did we actually take a vote on the approval of the agenda? Okay, good. Just checking. Okay. Okay, next up, we're going to have a study session, Budget 2021-22 General Fund discussion by Karen Anderson. Is that mic on?
I have a little bit of an audience. Tonight, we're going to talk about the general fund budget for next year, 2021-22. There's just too many 20s these days.
Do you know if is your mic on, Karen? I can barely hear you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right. I'm trying to be close to the screen also. So there we go. Okay. General fund. Day-to-day operations, this is where everything happens for our instructional programs, and this is the biggie. So we're going to start out and talk a little bit about enrollment. So we're going to talk about what we anticipated for current year, 2021, where we ended up, where we think we're going to go, and after this, I'll show you a visual of what's actually happened. So coming out, go back and remember that in March of 2020, we all went home. And so we did not take enrollment for April, May, and June of 1920 fiscal year. So what happened is that the state did an algorithm and they did a calculation and they estimated based on prior years what would have happened to our enrollment. So where they started in March, what we reported in March, they gave us adjustments through these calculations similar to previous years for April, May, and June. So our 1920 ending average, annual average, is based on a calculation for 3 months from March, actual March. So when we went into 2021, we anticipated that we would be very close to where we were ending. We really didn't know what was going to happen, but we figured that we were going to at least have what we had in 1920, but there's a possibility that we could lose some. So we ratcheted down our anticipation for enrollment. So this is what we started with for actual, or for budgeted enrollment. And you can see that we took a big dip the minute that we were announcing that we were going to be doing remote and we were going to slowly bring students back. This is the actual what happened to our enrollment. I'm going to turn this way so I can kind of talk and see.
To clarify, the
Yes.
2020-2021 budget, the 620 number down to the 9,000.
This column.
Yeah, that number wasn't ratcheted down.
It was.
It was? Because I went back and looked and I thought it was the same.
It was slightly based on where we were in March.
Oh, okay.
So we looked at where we were at in March, and we said, there's a good chance that we may not get the enrollment that we were thinking we're going to get. And so we did. We kind of lowballed. We took some away.
So we
Not a
were
lot.
at 9,203.
Yes, yes. So as you can see, some of the results of what actually happened is our in-person came in at about 7,900. Our virtual academy, we didn't see a lot there. Where we saw a big jump was in the running start numbers. So we were able to keep some of our enrollment through that. And then this is a new program that we actually started last year, or last year. And so we were able to capture some students. That's FTE. We actually had about 8 students that were coming in, and some of our students started entering into this program late in the year, so we don't get full FTE for them. But it is a program that's available to students throughout the year, and so it's a re-engagement program, and we will continue this into the next year.
And we don't get full FTE for running start either, do we? Or is it?
No.
No, okay.
Running Start, we get a percentage of the revenue so we pay the colleges where the students are going, and we keep about 7% of the revenue. So going into this next year, from 1920 actual to what we're looking at here, what actually came about in 2021, we lost about 900 students. And so we had to figure out what we were going to do as far as what do we project for next year. The hope is that we're going to be back in person. We're going to have more kids wanting to come back because they can get into the schools. So we started looking at what does that look like as far as recovery of the 900 that we lost. So we started out projecting a 50% recovery. So we anticipated that of the 900 that we lost from one year to the next, we were hopeful that we would recover about 50%. So we started out with that. Then some things happened in July, and we were watching all registrations. So we weren't just watching kindergarten registration, because anyone that exited our system in 2021 had to re-register. So we were watching and monitoring all new registrations across the board, all grade levels. In July, we took a look at, we did a comparison of where we ended in June and how many new registrations we had at each level. At that point, we were also looking at staffing. So we knew, we were anticipating that we were going to have to do some type of social distancing in our classrooms. So we were still maintaining that lower class size for our classrooms. So knowing this, we wanted to make sure that we were properly staffed. So we looked at the actual registrations that were coming in. The only ones that we didn't really adjust were the 11th and 12th grade. And the reason why is because a lot of our 11th and 12th graders, they go to Running Start. So it wouldn't be helpful to increase based on actual enrollment there, new enrollments there, because they could be enrolling, but they're going to go to Running Start. So we had to make some decisions, and we decided not to increase at those levels. But other levels where it was affecting staffing, filling classrooms and such, we decided that we were going to start to ratchet up. And so we pretty much went from a 50% recovery to it's somewhere around 62%. So that's where we're at this point.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I thought the most recent guidance that came out of the governor's office said that 3 feet spacing, but flexible. You don't have to do 3 feet spacing. It prevents you from bringing all your kids back.
And for the most part, that is what we're trying to do. What we are doing,
I thought we would have had a lot more kids coming back than 60%.
So there's kids coming back and how we're staffing classrooms.
Okay.
So we are looking at 3 foot. There are some spaces where if we can get an extra desk in, it might be 2.5, it might be 2 3/4. But as much as possible, if we're seeing students coming in, we're trying to get them into classrooms. That's why we're also watching the registrations. But I would say, on the average, our classes are holding about 20 to 22 students. And typically, we staff at 23 in K3 and 28 in the higher grades. So if we're reducing down to 20, 22, 23, in any of those classrooms, we're going to need more staff. So this is pretty much what we're looking at as far as this is what we're building the budget on at this point in time. 8,551 are in our classrooms in our schools. The Global Virtual Academy, we're changing from PIA to the Global Virtual Academy. We're anticipating about 100 students at least. The hope is that we have more students that decide to come back, want to do a remote learning at this point, and if this is their option for doing that. Our teachers, our curriculum, teaching our kids. We're looking at about 450 for Running Start, which is very similar to what has happened in previous years. And then again, we've got slots for 20 students in the outdoor or the Open Doors program, and so we are continuing that. And again, it may not come in at 20, but we want to anticipate we've got that many slots available for students. Question?
You said you're anticipating 100 for PIA, or excuse me, Global Virtual Academy?
Yes.
GVA?
Yes.
Is that anticipation just like, here's what we're guessing, or do you see people signing up already?
We are taking some registrations. I honestly don't know where we're at this point in time, but we are getting some positive response. I think we are up at 70, right around 70 right now. But depending on what happens over the next month, some of the changes that are coming about, and some of the caseloads and such, there may be decisions. There may be different decisions. So there might be some of the registrations that we currently have, they may choose to shift over to Global Virtual instead of being in our schools. So,
and so a family could choose to do that right today or before.
Yeah.
And I know when you guys were building Global Virtual Academy, you understood that you needed to have that flexibility to grow.
Yep.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So I would say the other thing too is we are looking at middle school. You know, what can we offer for middle school? So if we come up with something for middle school, then that could add to the numbers too. It's either in the classroom, or if we have another option for them for remote learning or ALE, alternative learning education, then that will help our numbers too.
Okay.
We're going to try and get as many kids through the doors and in our, in our district.
And we
back
didn't
in our
build
district.
a middle school program yet because it wasn't in demand. I mean, there wasn't an
There wasn't a
interest.
high demand, so I think we're looking into that. We're having conversation about what would that look like if we decided to do something. Somewhere along the line, we may have to reach out and find out if there is an interest.
Okay.
So, the hope at this point, I will say that our kinder is down. We're not there. We're at about 80% of our projections. The early thought was we're going to get a bunch of kindergartners in September. They're just going to show up. And sometimes that happens. With the number of cases taking place right now, that may not happen. And so we're just going to wait and see. We are seeing an uptick in the high schools, but again, they're bodies. They don't always translate. One body doesn't always translate to one FTE, the same as they do in the elementary and the middle schools. They're pretty close, but it's about 94 to 96% because they do other things. They might go to Running Start for part of the year or part of their day. So those are some nuances with the upper grades in the high schools.
Do we know where those kids are at that we've lost?
I would say there are a lot of kids that are being homeschooled.
Yeah.
There are other programs out there that I think if they disenrolled, they might be enrolling in another type of a remote learning or an alternative learning program.
So we can only speculate. We don't have a tracking.
Yeah, and we don't necessarily have a mechanism to be able to reach out. It's kind of tricky, but once they've exited our district, we don't really have a connection with them.
Right.
So we have to find ways to encourage them to look back into our district. They live in our district, so the hope is that when we produce the right educational program for them, that they'll have interest and they'll join us.
Right.
So this is a visual of what's happened. And so here you can see the jump. So this is our 900 student loss between 1920 and 2021. And as you can see, this is what we're anticipating, and this is for building, only those kids that are in the buildings. And so if we get back, this is about 60 to 62% of what we lost. If we find ways to bring kids back in, if we can be safe, if we can put all the things in place that we need to put in place, then the hope is that we come in higher than our projections. So if we're lowballing our projections, if we get more students, that'll be more revenue and it will help offset, the costs of more staffing that go with more students. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, any questions about this? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about revenue and revenue assistance that's occurred both this year and will occur for next year, because there's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of information that's out there, but it's not always clear. So when we were hit with COVID, one of the things that happened is that because we generate our revenue by student counts and enrollment, we took a huge dip in our apportionment, our basic ed apportionment, because we lost 900 students. So we were losing a little over $9 million out of our operating budget. So a couple things happened. At the same time, the federal government was starting to acknowledge that they needed to help support education. And so they created the CARES Act, which is our ESSER 1, and don't ask me what ESSER stands for. But they gave us funding for CARES Act, they gave us funding for ESSER 2, and they gave us funding for ESSER 3. They all came at different times. They were all calculated based on the Title I calculation for allocations. And that's based on whatever district, whatever your poverty percentage is. Our poverty percentage is low. It's about 20%. So there are a lot of districts out there that are 70, 80, 90% poverty. They're Title I districts, they're Title I schools, they have many. They got a lot of the ESSER funding. And so when the legislature met last spring, they had to look at the disparities for those districts that got a lot of federal funding through ESSER and those that didn't. And so one of the things that they said was, we've got to find a way for those that were impacted, highly impacted with enrollment loss, then we need to look at that. Because if they can't make it up in ESSER funding, then should we do something? And so they established what was called the enrollment stabilization. Because we didn't get that much in ESSER funding, we were eligible for state funding through the enrollment stabilization. And we were able to get a little over $8 million through enrollment stabilization. The other thing that happened is that transportation allocations are based on ridership. It's just one thing, but ridership, number of miles driven. There's 5 different factors that generate your transportation funding. Early on, the state took away half of our allocation. So our allocation originally was about $5,500,000, a little over, and they took half of that away. So we were operating. We were running buses. From September on, we were bringing kindergarten in. We started bringing first grade in. Then we went to the hybrid. We were doing double runs for 3 through 5. So we actually, our drivers bid routes 3 times last year, or this year. So we were incurring costs that we're not going to match, that we're not going to be covered by our $2.5 million budget for transportation. So the legislature also recognized this as a problem. And so they also gave funding for transportation stabilization. We were also eligible for this because we didn't get as much in ESSER funding, federal funding support. So that equated to a little over $1.4 million. That, along with the half of what we had, brought us within about $1 million. We're still short about $1.2 million from our original allocation, but it helped keep us whole, and it helped us maintain what we did do. And we didn't have to claim any of that, what we actually did, because we were doing other things. We were delivering meals to kids. We were running some buses out there for Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi connections in some of those neighborhoods. So we were using our transportation for more than just home to school. And so part of that was a claimable expense against CARES Act or ESSER too. And so what that allowed is it relieved us from having to use our ESSER funding faster than the others because we didn't have that much. So in 2021, the first funding that came from the federal government was the CARES Act, and we received about $628,000. We used that for additional PPE that we purchased. We had to put up barriers for office staff. We had some disparities between what we were funded on for food service versus what we were incurring as far as expense. So loss of revenue, because we couldn't claim any, we couldn't charge for any meals. So we used our CARES Act quickly. It wasn't a lot to begin with. We used about $500,000 that we claimed for last year. We used a lot of it in July and August, as we were getting ready to start school this year. And we used the balance of that in September, October, and we claim it. So we get it as we claim it. So we spend it, we claim it, then we get it. So our CARES Act funding, we claimed a portion of it in 1920. We're claiming the balance of it in 2021. So for 21-22, there's a couple of additional things that the legislature did. So for the 2022 Levy Collection, they are allowing us to go back to our enrollment for 2019-20 because it's larger than where we're at now. So, and that's a big deal because right now we're getting funded per student. So we can use the higher student enrollment number for our 2022 collection. And that's huge because that creates an additional funding that if we were going with a smaller enrollment, if we were going with this year's enrollment, we would be losing levy dollars. And so we'll talk a little bit about that when we go to the collection page. The other two ESSER revenues that we have coming in is ESSER 2, a little over $1.1 million, and ESSER 3, a little over $2.5. The legislature made the ESSER 2 revenues available. And again, all of the ESSER funding is based on what you spend, what you claim, then you get it. So we were eligible to start claiming ESSER 2 dollars this year, back in April, May timeframe, and we could start claiming the ESSER 3 dollars in July. We have not claimed any of it yet. We have expenses. We are looking at that and figuring out which ones qualify for ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. There's a little bit of variance in the rules of how you can use the dollars and what they're for. A lot of it is just reopening. So some of the things that we are using ESSER funding for is any of our summer programs this year. We did enhanced summer programs for our students. So we're going to use those ESSER funds, ESSER 2 funds for those. So we'll probably end up claiming and putting them into 2021. But because we haven't claimed any of them, we built our budget and we put them into the 21-22 fiscal year budget. So overall, we got about $4.7 million in ESSER funding. Not a lot. Without that, and you'll see, without that, the $8.6 million that we got in enrollment stabilization and the $1.4 that we got in transportation funding is really helping us to keep going and to keep going over a 2-year period. So we're trying to drag and make anything that we got this year last to support what we did in 2021 into 21-22. And you'll see some of the changes that have happened with the budget. So if you looked at budget to budget, we didn't know about all these changes when we built our budget in 2021. Now we do. And so you'll see there's some disparities in our revenues and where those are, and you'll also see that in expenditures also. Any questions? A lot of talking. Okay.
and ESER 3 approach that we have here, that was also based on our Title I.
It's based on a Title I formula,
So
yes.
we as well got a lower percentage.
Correct,
Okay.
correct.
The enrollment stabilization and transportation stabilization, because we got more, because of our ESSER funds were lower, will that ever kind of come back to haunt us in terms of future allocations of, oh, Minnesota got more here, so we're
No.
going to less than something else?
No, these are one-time dollars. So these are not ongoing. At this point, they kept us whole. Because if you remember, when we went into 2021, we staffed based on what we knew at that time. So we had full classrooms, and then all of a sudden we had to go remote. And so we had typical ongoing expenses. And then all of a sudden we had 900 students disappear. So we had class sizes that were a lot lower than what we normally would have staffed. And so in typical terms, if we could have condensed some of those classes, we would have, but we already had staff on contract. We already had paras hired. We already had our operations working. So we were going with what we believed was going to happen. And then when we lost those students, we still had to operate.
Yeah.
So with that loss of over $9 million, the enrollment stabilization allowed us to keep supporting our normal operations.
So these dollars weren't necessarily extra dollars for us to put anywhere we want. They were basically already
They were to
established in our
support the
budget.
loss that we incurred,
Okay.
the
All right.
revenue that we weren't going to get.
Okay, did those come, and the stabilization or the ESSER funds, did they have like, here's specifically what you need to spend on, these on, or was it?
ESSER, yes. So again, ESSER funding, you have to spend it and
Yeah.
claim it before you get it.
Has to be a,
And so there are stipulations. So if we pay for staffing with ESSER fund, it's a federal program, we have to do time and effort, what is called time and effort on that. So we have to have a way that basically says this employee was funded through federal funds, and therefore we have to document their time and effort that supports that federal charge.
gotcha.
So there are a lot of different things. One of the things that they talked about with ESSER funding is reopening, getting kids back into school, and that's a big, big deal for this next year. So ESSER 3 really supports that learning loss, and what are you doing for learning loss, and what are you doing to get kids back into school. So one of the things that we're doing is, we know we've got fewer students, but we still have to do that social distancing. So we are going to charge additional FTE to ESSER funds, and we'll do all the things that we have to do, and then we'll start claiming those dollars.
I
David?
know you have more questions, but I'm still stuck on this. We need to maintain social distancing. The governor said if we can't bring the kids back, we don't need to stay 3 feet. Why can't we just go back to no distancing? So clear that up for me, because I remember 3 feet, but if you can't get your kids back in school, no distancing. So why can't we just go to no distancing?
So I would say that we're trying to honor the language. So the language says 3-foot distancing wherever possible. So we want kids back in school, but we still have to be safe, and we need to keep those safety rules. And so we have to have a 6-foot perimeter for teachers. So we've got a space set in each classroom for teachers. And then we have to put the students in. So it's trying to maintain that comfort, that we're trying to honor the 3-foot, but there are going to be exceptions. But are we going to be able to put 25, 26, 27, 28 students in a classroom? Not unless it's a big classroom. And so I would say that we're trying to do the best that we can to honor the language, but also to make sure that we get kids in to the classrooms. The nice thing is, the nice thing is that we have elementaries. We have new elementaries. So we have a lot more classrooms at the elementary level, which is fantastic. Where we are having some challenges is at the high schools and the middle schools. And so that's where we've got some challenges. But for the most part, we are trying to honor the language. We're trying to get kids back in school, but we're also trying to keep everyone safe.
I'd also say that if you are honoring the distancing and you have fewer kids in a classroom, that's going to help with our learning recovery as well, because you have a teacher that has fewer.
Yeah.
And we saw so much success with the smaller class sizes this year and teachers being able to be so effective with their kids.
Yeah.
So hopefully that will help with the learning loss that we've experienced as well.
And that also goes to, so typically we have a formula for how we staff. So if we staff elementary classes at 23, but now I'm only staffing them at 18, 19, 20, then I can compare what I would have done for FTE and what I am doing for FTE, and that difference can be charged to ESSER. Because it's supporting the learning, and it's supporting us getting kids back into school. So those are things that we're looking at, and that's how we're going to be using
Would
our
the ESSER funds then pay for the FTE that cover those? So is that what you just? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good, okay.
Yeah.
And you're not saying we can't get everyone back in with the 3 foot,
No.
are you?
No.
No, okay.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so there's no cap on students. We will continue to, anyone who wants to be in person will be in person. We're not saying.
That's where I was headed with it.
We are trying. I mean, there may be, we may have to massage it a little bit, but we're trying to get everyone in the right schools. So we're trying to get kids into their home schools, but there are times where even in normal times, we hit those caps and we don't have any more space for kids. And so we unfortunately have to, talk about all alternative options. Can you go over to this school? They've got openings in second grade and we just don't have any openings. So it's challenging, but we try to work with families and we try to work with our buildings so that we're not impacting them any more than we have to.
And we have some extra portables now that the not that I want our high schools and middle schools and portables, but if it gets us through and gets us a space.
Yeah.
And I would like to lean in and
Unfortunately,
say, it is 5 days a week, and that
Yes.
has been a year plus months.
Yes.
That has
Yes.
happened. So the planning around that, doing that safely, having health be our priority, and also face-to-face in person for those families that choose that 5 days a week, that is the priority.
Yes.
With all the additional classrooms at the elementary level, have you looked at going K through 6 at that level to allow
We
the
haven't,
space?
but it doesn't mean that we can't. So I guess what I would say is, it hasn't come up at this point, but there may come a time where we have to make some decisions, and
Yeah.
who knows what that looks like. Maybe next year, the following year, It just depends on how things all play out. We thought we were going into this next year and pretty positive and everything, and now all of a sudden we're hearing some new language and some new guidelines, and so who knows what's going to happen with the Delta variant being out there and more cases coming up. It's just. Yeah. We're doing the best that we can, and we're trying to stay positive. We built the budget. What I will say is we built a budget based on what we knew.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that it's not a good budget. It just means that it's a budget. It's not hard, fast stone. If things don't materialize the way that we think, we're going to have to make adjustments, and we're going to have to figure it out. And that's just how we have to go.
We've also talked about adding some enticements for the homeschool kids, offering a science lab or something like that that would bring
So
them
that's
in.
that's part of what we decided to do for the elementary level, was to create a remote option for students that's very similar to what we had this year, but also maybe connects with some of those homeschool kids. And so that is something that the overall academies at Henderson Bay, that is an avenue that we will pursue. I'm just not sure how quickly we'll do that, but I would say that the first place that it will happen will be at the elementary level. And we have that program operating at Discovery this next year.
Oh, we do.
Okay? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to, Natalie caught my error. So this is my error that I know of. I redid this page, and my rollbacks are not correct. I didn't have the right rollback amounts in there. So I will fix it, and I will correct it. But this is kind of how the levy collection is calculated now. And keep in mind that it's actually, we collect on the calendar year, and we build our spending plan based on a fiscal year. So we get a percentage from our 2021 in the fall of 21, and the balance is from our spring collection in 2022. And so overall, once we calculate what is coming in, this is our levy amount. So again, the legislature kind of did us a favor. So for the 2022 levy calculation, it's by pupil. Well, we would have to use our 2021 enrollment, which is lower than where we were in 1920, because we lost 900 students. So that would have actually calculated probably about 23, even maybe 22.5 for our levy. The legislature saw this and said, you know what, we're going to let you use your 1920 enrollment if it comes in higher, so whichever is higher. So some districts didn't lose as many, and they actually did gain. Probably not very many, but some did. So for those districts that calculate their levy on pupil amount, then they can use the higher enrollment for either the 1920 enrollment or the 2021 enrollment, whichever is higher. So we are using the enrollment from 1920. So that's why these two numbers are the same. Okay? Yeah.
Two things. One,
It keeps turning on and I then, okay, sorry, thank you. So the estimated rollback, just to be clear, not the number, just even the term, that is estimated, it's not, we're not going to turn around and send money back to the taxpayers. We are collecting less than what we asked for in the levy. So I just want to make sure people understand that it's not we're not rolling funds back. It's just we're not collecting them to begin with.
Correct.
Okay.
So what happens is that, and this has become a lot more complicated, but what happens is that now we go ahead and we always estimate where we think we're going to be. So we have to look at enrollment, we have to look at what do we think is going to happen to CPI over the next few years. So anytime that we calculate and we decide what we're going to take out to our voters, we have to do a lot of estimates. Those estimates generate dollars, and those dollars are capped. Those are the maximum amounts that we could collect. But we can only collect them if all of our estimates are right on and the same as what we had estimated originally. So the voters have approved these amounts, but that doesn't mean that we can claim them. And so when we do our annual certification for our levy, for our next year's levy, we have to go through that calculation. And again, you'll remember that even though I've done this calculation, this is my estimate, we have to do it again. So now because we're a per pupil district, the state certifies the enrollment, the ending enrollment for the given fiscal year, the prior fiscal year. They send that to the counties, and the counties redo the calculation. So you'll remember that in the fall, we'll do a resolution that basically says, this is what we had in our budget, because it was an estimate, but we want you to go back and calculate it so that we can maximize the dollars that we're going to collect. And the only reason we do that is because sometimes there's a little change in the enrollment that maybe we weren't aware of, or it occurred in August because we went back and we corrected something. And so the enrollment that is certified by OSPI and given to the auditors, we ask them to take that and use it as the calculation. One of the things that I'm going to do this year is I want to make sure that the enrollment that they're giving is the 1920 enrollment, because it is the higher amount. And I want to make sure that, you know, our auditors know that. I'm sure that they do.
Good reminder.
But I just want to make sure that we're not given a number and it's too late to make a change. So
the estimated rollback is basically,
Yes.
we're collecting less than what the voters said
Correct.
we could even approve up to. Okay.
Correct.
And then my second question on that is, have we thought about a communication to our public? Because we've got a very savvy community about the understanding how we're looking at the 2019-2020 enrollment versus a 2020 2021 enrollment, just so they understand why we're doing it that way. I mean, I think it would be, again, we've got some pretty savvy researchers out there, and I would want to make sure that they understood that.
Yeah. So keep in mind, we did a 3-year levy instead of a 4-year levy this last time. One of the things that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to start thinking about a new levy ask, and we'll have to take that out in February of 2023. So we're halfway through our current levy. So one of the things that would help us, and we had the audit committee, the finance and audit committee work with us last time to do the calculations. But it would be helpful, and the plan would be to bring them up to speed. So this is what we did with our calculations. This is what we thought was going to happen. But this is what actually has happened. And then there's been some changes in the rules. So there were a couple of changes in the rules that we didn't even know about, which is very typical with school finance. And so we can bring that committee up to speed. And as we do that, that is something that maybe we can put on our, budget page, and we can just give everyone an update. This is what we thought we were going to ask for. This is what has actually happened, because it affects the tax rate also. So originally, when we go out, we say we're estimating a certain tax rate. Well, assessed value changes. We're not spot on that. Our enrollment has changed. CPI has changed. So all the factors that we use are estimates. And so it'd be nice to be able to go back and say, this is what actually happened, and this is what your tax rate is, based on what we originally came out and asked for. Because it'll make a big difference when we go back out, because it's going to be a replacement levy, but we still have to educate folks, and they need to understand that they might be looking at big numbers, but we also don't want to lose dollars. So we're going to estimate high. But the reality is that we had rollbacks because we weren't eligible to ask for those dollar amounts. So it's a different conversation. It's a different education. But it's a new way of calculating and looking at things. And so we have to share that information now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Okay. So first I'm going to talk to you, we're going to look at things budget to budget. So remember that I was talking about there are some significant changes in this year's budget versus last year's budget. So we're going to compare budget to budget, and then I'll show you the actual revenue dollars. So for our levy, so the good news is that we can claim based on the 1920 enrollment, but our levy is only increasing by about $600,000. Not a lot. During 2021, we stopped a lot of fees. So we didn't do pay to play. We didn't do classroom fees. We didn't get a lot of donations. So we had to make a lot of adjustments. Another big thing that we didn't claim is we didn't have local meals being paid for by parents. And that used to be like over $1 million. So we adjusted this year's budget to reflect some of those changes because they're ongoing. Next year, food service is still a summer program. It's still all kids can get food, and no one pays. And so that program is going to continue into next year. So we're not going to be collecting anything for meals. So we had to make some changes. And so one of the impacts, this is typically a $3 million budget. We're taking out about $2.2 million of that. For our state apportionment, we're actually, keep in mind, our enrollment is lower than it was. And so if you look at budget to budget, because we lost enrollment last year, we're not quite there. We're only capturing about 60% of that loss. And so we're actually losing a little bit in state apportionment if you compare budget to budget. For our state programs, again, student enrollment drives our state dollars and our state program. So again, we're losing if you're comparing one budget year to the next. Yes. Now keep in mind, we're only looking at budget to budget. When we budgeted last year for 2021, we didn't know that we were going to lose 900 kids. They were built into that budget. So if I'm comparing one budget to the next, now I know that those kids aren't there, and I'm only recovering 60%. So I'm still not up to where I was last year based on my calculation. Does that make sense?
So who's allowing us to use the old numbers? The state does not?
So keep in mind, we're talking budget to budget. So when I did a calculation for my 2021 budget for my categorical programs and my apportionment, I was basing it on what I thought was going to happen for 2021. So I was building it based on, let me go back.
Right, but you were
I was
saying,
building it on this number,
right,
okay?
and the state is allowing us to use that again, that number.
No. The state is allowing us to use the 1920.
Oh, okay.
Actual.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I get it now.
But the 1920, so if we go here, this is the 1920
Right.
enrollment.
Which was down lower than we.
This year's budget, this next budget,
Yeah.
is based on this enrollment.
Mm-hmm.
So my budget for this year, I came in lower,
Got it.
okay? But I budgeted something right up in here.
Yeah,
So based on this bigger number.
yeah.
So if I'm comparing budget to budget, even though I've had increases in my state allocations and all that, the offset is still a little bit of a loss because I have fewer students that I'm overall building the budget on.
Okay.
So here's where you see the change. So federal programs. This is where the ESSER funding is dropping in. The other piece is that because we're operating a national school lunch program that is funded by the federal government, these are all adding to what we normally get in federal funding. So this is a huge increase to our federal funding compared to the previous budget. So we're getting about $4.2 million more in federal funding than we have in the previous budget. And then there's really no change in this last category. It's pretty much the same as what we've always budgeted. So overall, our revenue budget is only increasing about $1.6 million. Okay?
Karen, on the local non-tax.
Yes.
And I completely understand why we eliminated class fees and the pay-to-play participant and all that, and completely appreciate that for families, and that's going to happen this next year as well, correct? And again, I appreciate it so much for our families. One thing we may want to consider, though, is making sure that people don't expect that for years to come. Because that's a big loss in our budget, and we'll eventually need to add those back in, I believe. And if we do anticipate doing that, I think maybe we should be very clear, because there's some people just getting into our system, and then they'll feel like it's an add-on in the future versus we're doing something to help families right now. Does that make sense?
It does. So there is some legislation out there that's talking about equity.
Okay.
Equity for families, equity for kids. At each of our secondary schools, we have to do a calculation that says, what is our equity gap? So part of what we're doing here is by eliminating these fees, that really helps with the equity gap that we have at our high schools.
Totally agree.
So if and when we decide we want to look at implementing fees, we have to look at it differently.
Good.
I don't know that it'll be the same.
Good.
It's not, okay, now we're good, we're going to go back to the way it was. We have to have the conversations. We have to say, what did this do for our equity gaps at each of our schools, and what do we still need to do? Because part of that is ASB too. So we have to educate people. We have to talk about what the issue is and what are the solutions. And it's not just us making that decision. We've got to involve students. We've got to involve staff, advisors, coaches. We have to involve everyone in the school community so they understand what the goal is.
Okay. I completely appreciate that broader conversation, because I know currently when we were collecting fees, we had a program if somebody couldn't, but they would have to reach out to counselor, and it was challenging. So if we can level that playing field in the future, that's fantastic. So I didn't want to just go back to like slapping it back on, because it was hard on families.
And I don't think that we can. In all fairness, we have to say, is this really the right thing to do? And we have to be purposeful. Honestly, we were collecting the dollars, but was it necessary? Was it really what we needed to be doing? So we have to ask the hard questions, and we have to have the conversations about what makes the most sense. And then how are we reducing the barriers for those that, if we do implement a fee, that can't pay that fee? So we have to have those conversations. It's a free and public education that we're supposed to be providing. So we have to figure out how to do that. I'll get off my soapbox now. All right. So our revenues. This is what our revenues look like for this next budget. So our local taxes, this is our education programs and operations levy, a little over $24 million. Our local non-tax, so donations, sale of goods, facility rentals, investment earnings, E-rate, is a little over $1 million. Keep in mind, in the past, it was about $3 million. So you can see a big difference here. Our state apportionment is coming in at about $87 million. Our state programs are coming in at around $20 million. Here's where you typically would see about $4 million for federal funds. Now we've got a little over $8 million coming in, and that's because of the ESSER and the National School Lunch increases for all meals. And then typically our other, which is our revenue contingency and small grants that we have, is pretty much the same as what it was in previous years. So our revenue budget is about $142 million. And this is what it looks like on a visual. Keeping in mind that, so our state has gone down just a little bit, but our federal has increased. So we were getting about 3% in federal funds, and this next year we're going to get close to 6%. Okay, I'm going to switch over to expenditures. Of course, with our biggest cost is staffing. We've got salaries and benefits. Some good news. So we have, well, good news, bad news. Our largest bargaining group, which is our teachers, we are not negotiating with them this year. We already have, but we're negotiating with everyone else. So that, a little bit of a challenge. And we haven't finished negotiations. So we had to build in some estimates for where we think we're going to go. What I can say is that our state allocation factors were increased by the implicit price deflator, which is 2% for this next year. For our employee benefits, so we've got statutory benefits and permissive benefits. Our retirement rates actually went down a little bit, which is positive. Unemployment is up a little bit because of what happened this last year. SEB, so our annual cost per employee went down. It's a slight decrease. Last year it was $12,000 per employee. This year it's a little over $11,000, so a slight decrease there. So overall, the impact to staffing is staffing and any negotiated increases. Okay. And then we have our materials, supplies, and operating costs, and there have been some adjustments there for costs for next year. Yeah.
Has there been any change in the SEB fees for part-time employees that meet a certain threshold? So we're still
It's
doing
still
that?
the same. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So staffing, again, I'm comparing budget to budget. Okay. So last year we budgeted this 662 certificated FTE and 375, a little over 375 for classified. This year's budget has 680 FTE for certificated and 374 for classified. So for classified, it's a little bit of a decrease, but I can say that there are some pluses and minuses in categories. So keep in mind, we didn't know what the impacts were going to be for drivers. We didn't know what the impacts were going to be for paras in the classroom. So with fewer students, some of those FTE that we had budgeted didn't materialize. We didn't have the need. And so some of those pieces, like our bus drivers, they weren't full-time right from the get-go. So as they bid 3 times during the year, their FTE increased because they had longer routes and they were driving more. So there were some differences, but overall, we had budgeted for them. It's just if you compared actual to budget, you would see that increase because we didn't incur all of that FTE. For certificated, it's a little bit different because they're on contract. So we did have those staff, and we did incur, and so we didn't really see that difference. What I would say is that this is because of some of the things that we're implementing for next year, and we're going to put those against our ESSER. So, Global Virtual Academy, the Bridge Academy, we committed staff to that. We also are bringing in three FTE for transitional kindergarten. So those are all ways of getting kids in and supporting the instructional program. So if there's learning loss, how are we helping support that? So these are all things. So a lot of this new staffing we can charge to ESSER. And the hope is that, yes, ESSER is one-time money, but once we get kids back in school, the hope is that the following year, we're going to have more kids coming back in. We're going to be right back up there, and we're going to be earning the revenue to support the staffing that we have. And keep in mind, we're doing this as a 2-year fix. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. The other thing about the classified staffing is, yes, there's some differences in categories. So in special ed, I might not have as many paras. So I could see a reduction in paras in maybe special ed, but on the basic ed, I'm hiring crossing guards for Swiftwater, and I'm hiring new support staff for Swiftwater. So there's pluses and minuses, and so the bottom line, if I compare budget to budget, there's not a lot of difference in classified staffing at this point in time. So again, we're going to compare the changes from one year to the next. So for our staffing salary costs, we're increasing our budget by $5.7 million. Some of this is negotiated costs. As we have staff that they get experience, so that's an additional cost. Plus, we have additional staff, certificated staff that we hired. So that all leads to the additional increase. Again, because of some of the rates and changes in our fringe, I call them fringe and health benefit costs, we're actually seeing a little bit of a decrease. Keep in mind, when we built the 2021 budget, we had no idea what was going to happen with SEB. So I honestly can say we crammed some additional dollars in because we didn't know who was going to be eligible. So we are seeing a savings and a change and a slight decrease from one budget to the next in this category. The other thing that's happening is we're also seeing a little change in materials, supplies, and operating costs. Not a lot. Some of this has to do with there's pluses and there's minuses. So we have categorical programs. If they increased, then we have to, if we're using it for salary, then we're increasing there and we're shifting from another category. So for like ESSER might have supported some expenses before, but we've got expenses that hit, PPE, cleaning, filters, those types of things that relate to COVID. Those are additional costs, but we're going to shift those over and we're going to charge them to ESSER. So there's some shifts, but overall we're decreasing our MSOC budget by about $400,000, a little over. So overall, the change in our expenditure budget from one year to the next is an increase a little over $5 million. And this is what it looks like. So our certificated salaries are coming in a little over $66 million. Our classified are coming in a little over $23 million. Our employee benefits, a little over $34 million. Our supplies, a little over $9 million. Our purchase services, a little over 14. There's a lot of different things that are in purchase services. We have insurance, we have utilities, we have our food service contract, Those are probably the biggest ones, but if we're doing contracted services, so like some of our projects that we use the levy maintenance budget line, levy maintenance projects, a lot of those projects are contracted, so we have somebody from the outside come in and do those. That's an area where we would charge those. We have travel. Travel really didn't change much, but we have a little bit, and that's, travel that's budgeted on a regular basis for staff. And then we have capital outlay. And capital outlay is, it's kind of a beginning. We don't really know what is going to qualify for capital outlay. We do know that we get some music instruments that they exceed $5,000, and so we have to capitalize them. We now buy garbage bins that are over $5,000.
Wow.
We have vehicles that we purchase on a regular basis. We're trying to keep those up. So we have some replacement plans and recycle plans as far as for our vehicles. And then any other equipment, anything that exceeds a $5,000 amount, we capitalize those. So.
Karen, the proposed budget and the numbers there, that's anticipating your bargainings that you're working on right now?
We did put some additional in anticipating what we were negotiating. So overall, our expenditure budget is a little over $149 million. And this is a visual. And as you can see, our salaries and benefits are slowly creeping up. Over the years, they were about 79, but they are, going up. They're about 83.5% of our budget. But we're in the business. We're in the business to teach kids, and it takes people to run the organization, and so that's where our costs should be. Okay, so I'm going to try and explain this as best I can. We have our 2021 budget, and keep in mind I was comparing budget to budget. So you can see that for our revenues from one budget to the next, we are increasing. We've also increased our expenditures from one budget to the next. Where there are some differences is in fund balance and how much we're taking out of fund balance. So for this year, we had estimated that we were going to start with $12 million. We actually started at 17. And this is what happened this year. We got in revenue about $136 million. We spent $138, and we have an estimated ending balance of about $15 million. That is our enrollment stabilization and a little bit of our transportation stabilization that is falling into fund balance. Well, when we built our budget, we didn't. But we do now, and that's going to help us for next year. Because if we start with this, and these are our revenues and our expenditures, we're estimating we're going to take a lot more out of fund balance. So we're going to take our fund balance from 15 million, a little over 15 million, down to 8. That's because we've got the ESSER funding that's going to help support what we're doing, and we also have fund balance that can help support what we're doing. So what we're doing is we're spreading our revenues, what we've had, we're spreading it over the next, this year and next year. And that will help keep us whole. The goal would be that by the time we get out to 22, 23, the goal would be that we're back in business, we look a lot more normal, we've got our kids back, we're actually increasing in enrollment, we can make those adjustments, and we can keep going. If that doesn't happen, then we're going to have to make adjustments here. We're going to have to figure it out. And again, I'll just say, it's a budget. It's not hard and fast. It's not in cement. We have to roll with the punches, the same as what happened here. We didn't have the revenues coming in. We lost $9 million out of our budget. But the state came through and they gave us some extra funding. And that's going to help us get through next year. And we're going to have to monitor stuff. We're going to have to see what happens. We're going to have to monitor where our kids are, what's going on in our classrooms, what's going on in our district, what's going on at the state level. And we're just going to have to work through, work through the problem, but work through the system. So, yes, we are anticipating hitting our fund balance significantly, but I can say that we're still in a healthy place. We may not have the typical carryovers. We may have to use some of those carryovers up, but we are still in a good place. And we still are within the board goal, and our unreserved fund balance is within that 4 to 6%. Question?
I have a question about that, or just wondering if, with everything that's happened the last 2 years, which are, of course, unexpected and hopefully once-in-a-lifetime events, seeing everything that you've seen and trying to, do what you did, like you mentioned, keeping up with the equity and taking on some more expenses from the district, do you think that 4 to 6% is still an appropriate amount for the fund balance moving forward?
I think that's a little bit of a challenge. So one of the things that we have to look at is when we look at overall fund balance. So some of it's reserved and restricted, and some of it's unreserved. But what the state does, and they call them our fiscal indicators. So typically you look at your fund balance, and if everything stopped, how long could you survive with your fund balance? So our biggest expense is our monthly payroll. So how many months can we pay that payroll with our fund balance? If everything stopped and we weren't getting any revenue, what would that look like? They want you to have maybe 1.5 months at least. I would say that we're getting close to $8 million won't cover a payroll. We're right about 9.5 in our monthly payroll costs. And next year it'll be closer to 10. So that is something that we may have to have the conversation about. Right now, we do this calculation based on our budgeted expenditures. So it is something that we need to talk about, but we also need to think that the revenues and the revenues that we're getting this year are for this year. We don't want to build a big, hefty fund balance that's never going to come, never going to support the things that we need to do. So we have to find that happy medium. We have to be fiscally prudent and thoughtful, but we can't be unrealistic. And so I think it's worth the conversation, but I don't think that we can be so worried that we're not going to, that we're going to choke ourselves, I guess is what I would say. So I think it's a good conversation to have. I think there are different things that we need to look at. But, when I see a fund balance coming in, this is an estimate. Keep in mind, it's an estimate. Very typically, we do not spend 100% of our expenditure budget. We usually have savings in our MSOCs. We're pretty close with our salaries and benefits, but typically if you see anything left over, it's usually in the MSOCs. Everybody doesn't spend everything, and we give carryover, and we always have carryover. So what I would say is I don't want to paint a doom and gloom picture, because if you notice, whatever we build, whatever that plan is, we're building a contingency for expenditures. We have not hit that contingency in the past. So I don't want to say we're always going to be that way, but we do monitor it. We monitor it monthly, we monitor it annually to see where we're coming in. If we think that we're coming, we're ratcheting up and we're spending more of our MSOCs, then we have to figure out, okay, what does that realistically mean? Do we need to increase that? But we always have to look at our capacity, and what we try to do is maintain that ongoing expenditures, which are salaries and benefits, are first covered with our ongoing revenues. So if we do that, then we can make decisions about what happens to MSOC. Some of those MSOCs are ongoing. Insurance is ongoing. We always have to pay for that. Food service is an ongoing expense. But we don't always have to buy vehicles. We don't always have to do certain things. But what do we want to do to maintain a healthy system? And so those are the things that we have to look at.
Karen,
we're making
didn't that
choices.
4 to 6% fund balance, didn't that help us with our Moody rating and our bond sale and all that? So that saved us a lot,
It does.
right?
It does.
By having that. So it's something maybe to think about too when you think about the 4 to 6%. So, and then secondarily, 4.22%. So we're getting close to 4%, or the low end of it. If we project it out another year, are we still looking at these numbers, or are we
So
dropping?
that's what I'm working on right now.
Okay, all right. Not that this isn't enough, but
So a couple things. When you adopt budget, we also have to bring you a 3-year forecast. So pretty much what we're projecting for next year, and then 3 years after that. So as I alluded to, my hope and my forecast will say that by the time we get to 22, 23, we're going to have more kids. So yes, we're going to make adjustments because we're not going to have to social distance. So I might be back to my normal staffing kids.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have to make those adjustments, but that's what the hope would be. And then we can keep going. We can maintain that. And that's what my forecast will look like.
Okay.
I'm not going to put us in the red. I'm not going to paint a doom
That was my
and
real
gloom
question.
picture. No. But I have to be realistic.
Yeah.
The forecast, you have to remember that the forecast it's not in cement. It's the what ifs. So if I'm realistic with what my projections are, what does that look like 3 years out? It doesn't mean that it's going to happen. This year might not even happen this way. But we have to look at, and what that causes us to do is to say, what kind of decisions do we need to make in year 2 so we don't get here? So if we keep taking dollars from fund balance on an ongoing basis, it's one-time money. So we got to make sure that our fund balance, one-time money, is used for one-time things. This year, it's a fix. It's to get us through one time, but hopefully by 22, 23, we're back to normal operations. And we're back, we brought kids back. We're starting to increase enrollment again, like we were seeing those trends prior. And we're back in business. And so that would be the hope. That would be what I would build the forecast on. But I would also be a little bit conservative on that too. Okay, just a couple more slides, I promise. Okay, components of ending fund balance. We always like to share with you what's going on with this. Again, because we have such a large estimated ending fund balance, I want to share with you that we know that we've got some restricted categorical funds that we're going to have carryover in. We are buying a lot of devices, and so our inventory is going to end up high because they're going to go out in September, out to buildings. We still have our maintenance, our contingency for maintenance. And then we have carryovers. This is very typical of what we usually have for carryovers out in buildings and departments. So our restricted ending balance, we're looking at about $5.3 million. This is what we're going to need to use to get us through next year. So even though we're above our reserve, our reserve, this is what's going to save us for next year. And what we anticipate for this ending balance is we go back to a pretty, a stable inventory. We still have our contingency for maintenance and a minimal of carryovers. We don't know what that's going to look like, but typically we say if we give carryover, we're going to spend it all. Well, realistically, we don't. But we're going to have to look at that when we come to fruition. So, final comments. We have budget adoption on August 26th. We will have to have a public hearing. We've advertised for that. So we have a public hearing. Again, you are adopting a resolution for the expenditure budgets for each fund. Okay, that's our capacity. That's what we can do business on. If it looks like we're going to have to exceed, or we're going to exceed those budgets, we would have to bring a revision back to you. Okay. At the same time, we're also going to share with you our forecasts. What's going to happen with each fund for the next 3 years. They're forecasts. They're not anything that you can bank on. They're just projections and the what ifs. If there was a bad picture that we were painting, we have to have tough conversations. I don't like to do that. I don't like to play the gotchas or anything, but I will be realistic. I'll be a little bit conservative, but I believe that we can pull out of this, and if 22, 23 is a normal year, we'll be okay. We'll keep going. And the last thing that we typically do is we bring you the levy spending plan, and we have you approve the levy spending plan at the same time. So, any other questions?
Karen, and if you guys don't know, I will not be at the August 26th board meeting, so if I have questions on the budget forecast or anything else,
You can ask. Yeah. Yeah. No, I like to think of it as optimistic. We just have to not lose sight of what we're trying to do. So.
as always, I mean, I don't know how you
Figure out all of this stuff, and I can't imagine the spreadsheets behind all of this stuff, and your allocations of the ESSERs and the stabilizations and all that.
Well, I have
Amazing
helpers
work
too,
from you
so
and
yes.
everyone back at your team.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we have our next school board meeting will be on August 26th. And with no further comment by anybody?